How's it going? Welcome to another episode of the Rain Race Podcast. We're doing a Le Mans preview episode today. It's Thursday. I wanted to do this on Tuesday as always, but Kyle wasn't available on Tuesday. And it's actually all right that we're doing it Thursday because now we get to recap the practice and qualifying sessions. Guess what? Kyle still is not here. So I've called in an old friend of mine, an old backup plan who's been on the podcast before. Sorry to belittle you to that title of backup plan. But look who I got with me today.
Hi, I'm back.
Yes. For those who don't know, this is my friend Kevin. Used to be pretty regular on the podcast back in like the first season. But he's very knowledgeable when it comes to sports car racing, especially the 24 Hours of Le Mans. So I figured Kyle's not here. He's actually out in Indianapolis right now watching some guys go around a dirt track. So.
And you know who's also in Indianapolis but not watching people go around the dirt track?
Yeah, well, that's loyalty. See, that's what I appreciate is the loyalty right there. You're putting the priorities straight. Could have gone to watch Jeff Gordon go around a dirt track for the first time in like 25-something years.
No, I'd rather watch Kobayashi.
Yeah. Yeah, well, we're going to have to talk about that this episode, definitely. But like I said, there's a ton to talk about. I would consider, delving into a bit of IndyCar recap from last weekend when they were at the Indianapolis road course. I don't want to get too far into that because at this point it's Thursday. It's sort of past us at this point. You're going to Gateway this weekend. Will Power won at Indianapolis, though. Alex Palou ran into issues. That's pretty much all I'm going to touch on for the IndyCar race
And
at Indianapolis.
And the championship battle is a lot more interesting.
Correct. But I do want to spend a majority of this episode, pretty much the entirety of it, focusing on Le Mans, both recapping the practice and qualifying sessions. A couple of talking points I want to go over from both of those. We also have some news that's come out of this week, as annual when it comes to Le Mans. We always have a bunch of news and rumors coming out the week of the race. So we're going to be talking about that a little bit later on in the episode. Also, as always, you can leave your questions in the chat. Kevin and I will try to get to those, as many of those as we can, whenever it fits into what we're talking about. And we'll go from there. So the first thing I want to talk about today, not really going in sequential order, but I do want to talk about the Hypercar qualifying session that happened this afternoon. We're straight off the bat, without any warning or sort of build up to it whatsoever, Kamui Kobayashi was able to throw down a 3-minute 23.9 flat in the number 7 Toyota GR010. Now, I don't know about you, Kevin. I know you were listening to that session. I was actually watching it live on TV. I had no intentions whatsoever, or no expectation of us seeing a 3-minute 23 being put down today. I thought pole time was going to be a mid to low 25, if we're really lucky, a high 24. That 23.9, I think, for me at least, came out of absolutely nowhere.
Yeah, absolutely. We talked about how the ACO initially in the Hypercar era targeted like a 3:30-ish, I believe was the time that they wanted for. Right. And here we are, 6.1 seconds under that already. Honestly, this reminds me of when the ACO tried to limit the diesels to a time and kind of bring the competition closer, but that only drew the competition further apart. So I'm kind of curious to see where the hypercars will go in the next 2 or 3 years in terms of their pace and development. Because if we're seeing this kind of speed already, it's a clear indication that, hey, it's only going to get better from here in terms of times. Could we possibly see in 4 or 5 years, if Toyota's still around, them going and gunning to beat their own lap record? I don't know, but it's definitely going to be interesting to see.
Yeah, you mentioned that 3-minute 30 lap time target that was set by the ACO. I believe that was for race running, pretty much race lap time standards. They were predicting a little bit quicker than that because they actually didn't bump back the power as much as they were planning on. I believe they're running at the same power levels that they were at the Monza WEC round a couple of weeks ago. I guess about a month ago at this point. and they didn't actually limit the power of the cars like they traditionally would at Le Mans during the LMP1 days, to try to keep that separation between the hypercar and the LMP2 cars. So I think they were targeting realistically at this point around 3-minute 28, probably 3-minute 29 race lap times. We had a question that was asked by Taurus. So what was the pole time last year? I guess as a comparison, that was a 3-minute 15.2. So just shy of the overall Le Mans lap record in qualifying from last year's qualifying. So we're seeing about 8 seconds slower. Again, that 3-minute 23 really came out of nowhere for me. I was expecting a 25. I thought they would be at least 10 seconds slower. But you brought up the potential of these cars developing and really improving those lap times over the next few years, especially when we get more and more competition in the class. I certainly was thinking about that today. I think that that's definitely something we're going to have to look into for the coming years. The last time that they bumped back the LMP1 cars, I guess on a large scale for pace, was in 2011. I'm sure you know about that quite well.
Yeah.
Where 2010, they had the race lap record was set by, I believe it was Loic Duval in the Oreca 908, just in 2010. And then the following year, they bumped back the car's performance to around the 3-minute 30 mark, I think was what they were targeting with the race laps. And I want to say pole time that year was a 3:25. Don't quote me on that. You might have to look it up. So this certainly isn't unprecedented. We've seen it before. And
and I want to make the point that, that was 4 years into the diesel era at that point, and we're already achieving better qualifying times now than they were quite a bit into the diesel era.
Right. So I certainly see the development increasing over the next few years and really bringing those lap times down. I think the ACO is going to try to do as much as they can to control it, because we saw just a massive gap in lap times between 2014 qualifying and 2015, or I think it was like a 3-minute 20 or a 3-minute 21 pole time in 2014. And then 2015 was a 3-minute 16, which was the lap record at the time by the Porsche 919. That's basically a period where we had unlimited manufacturer spending in LMP1 hybrid. And that's ultimately what ended up killing the class, unfortunately. So I think the ACO is going to do everything they can to make sure we don't get into another spending war like that. But incremental improvements over the years, I think, could drive those lap times down. And I think for this to be a baseline, I'm very satisfied with what we saw today.
Well, and I want to throw this in there as well, as this isn't the first time the ACO has tried to push back the top class in terms of lap times. Like I mentioned before, they've done it multiple times in the past. About just over 10 years ago,
Right.
10 years ago, they tried to do it with LMP1s to bring the manufacturers closer to the privateers, and it only pushed the manufacturers themselves to go faster.
Right. I mean, you can limit them by regulation, but at the end of the day, these are engineers that are paid millions of dollars a year to try to get a couple tenths out of a car. As the years go on, they're definitely going to be able to find that pace. Sorry, what were you saying?
Something to note is that the two Toyotas are not that far off from each other, because the number 8 car was a 3:24.1, so they were only 0.295 off.
Yeah, right. I mean, we are seeing both of those Toyotas pretty similar on lap times. Looking down the rest of the class, though, obviously Toyota isn't the only manufacturer we have to look at this year. We had the Alpine in third place with a 3-minute 25.574. If you're keeping track, that's about 1.6, almost 1.7 seconds off the pole-sitting Toyota. And then the two Glickenhauses, the 708 and 709, rounded out the hypercar category with 3-minute 25.6 and 3-minute 27.6. So what I see right there, I think the Alpine and the Glickenhaus are pretty evenly matched, at least on qualifying pace. One thing I do want to point out, though, and I don't know if you were able to pick up on this as much as I was because you weren't actually seeing the visual representation of the cars on track, but the Glickenhaus in qualifying trim looked very unstable. especially if you can find an onboard of it going through the Porsche curves. I mean, they were really wrestling the car to the point where it looked like they were inches away from completely losing it. Um,
So I have seen some of the onboards of the Glickenhaus down the Molson Strait in particular, and also in the run up to Indianapolis. And it reminds me of a car that is not too much in the distant past, which would be the BR1, where that car would be a rocket ship in a straight line. However, it was also very unstable under braking because in the Glickenhaus, I mean, if you look at the design of it, it's pretty evident that it's more meant for straight line speed than ability to corner, especially in the Le Mans trim that we are seeing. So I think there are some similarities into the way the car is handled based off of just the attitude of the car, but that's just me.
yeah, actually, while you were talking about that, we got a couple of comments here that sort of go along with what you were saying on the topic of top speed. One of them is from Robbie Wynn. We had a question: do you think that top speed will become a priority over acceleration for teams over the next coming years? And then also Taurus asked, looking at old videos, there was a big top speed versus turn speed battle between McLaren and Porsche in the GT1 era. Will the wingless Peugeot bring that dynamic back? To answer Ronnie's question first, I mean, top speed is obviously a big priority at Le Mans. If you're going for anything in the car, whether it's handling, acceleration, or top speed is probably going to be the biggest priority for Le Mans. The main thing you have to realize is that with this era of cars, they are stuck into one sort of aero package, whereas in the past they were allowed up to three. Back in 2015, 2016, I'm looking towards when they were allowed three different aero configurations. Right now, they're only allowed one. So if you're running the entire WEC season, which pretty much all of the hypercar manufacturers, well, I guess they don't have to run the whole season because Glickenhaus isn't this year. But I think that's going to be the focus for the majority of them. You're going to want to focus on a car that's very good at Le Mans, but also not terrible at the other races. So I think to sort of toss everything else aside and focus all of your attention on top speed would be a mistake for the longevity of the championship, or I guess for your for how well you're going to do in the championship. But it is certainly the top priority for these manufacturers at Le Mans, I'd say.
Funny note, there was actually a program at Le Mans in the late 80s, early 90s. It was a WR Peugeot that they literally came to Le Mans for one reason, and that was to break the top speed record.
Right.
And they did, and then they broke, really before the race even really got going. So, fun little fact.
Well, yeah, that was the Project 400 program. I believe they got up to 406 kilometers per hour. But correct me if I'm wrong, but the 24 Hours of Le Mans wasn't a part of a sanctioned championship that year, was it? Was it part of the World Sports Car Championship?
I do not believe it was at the time.
Okay, so that's sort of where, I mean, Le Mans in the modern era, I guess, up until 2011 was the last year it wasn't part of a champ. Actually, it was part of a championship in 2011.
Yep.
It was part of the Intercontinental Le Mans Cup.
The very short.
But in 2010, it wasn't part of a championship. So they actually, you could show up to Le Mans with basically a purpose-built Le Mans racer and do whatever you wanted to try to contend for the win. So it's a little bit different now that it's actually part of a sanctioned championship where you might have to focus on an entire season. And then oh, sorry, what were you saying?
Well, to add on to that, though, you still had to be invited. So,
correct.
I mean, at the time, the people in the American Le Mans series, the regular Le Mans series, the Asian Le Mans series, those guys got priority because they're full season entrants. However, there was one-offs for Le Mans, so little note there.
Yeah. And then what Taurus asked about the top speed versus handling difference, will we see a battle with that looking into the, I guess, Peugeot wingless era?
We've always seen a top speed versus handling dynamic. We've always seen that kind of battle at Le Mans. One of the more interesting notes would be Audi versus Peugeot. Peugeot had a faster car. Audi had a better handling car in all conditions. Same thing can be said about Audi versus Porsche. Porsche was better in a straight line. Audi was better in areas like the Porsche curves. So that dynamic never really went away. It's going to be probably, in my opinion, more pronounced now, especially with the more open arms of the ACO in terms of rules, like how we're getting the wingless Peugeot.
Right. I think that's certainly one thing. That's what I was going to bring up. Also, that car still has a significant amount of downforce. It's just not quite visible because it's all underfloor downforce, or I guess underbody downforce, I should have said.
Yeah, with
Um,
the massive diffuser.
yeah. So I'd have to see a comparison of that car when it's actually on track versus some of the others like the Toyota to actually see where they're gaining and losing time. But I don't
Well,
think the differences are going to be as big as some people might make it out to be right now.
and I want to make a note that the Peugeot car is still subject to change. Now, I know they're going big for the wingless concept, and I expect that that will obviously be on track. But I think there might be like maybe a T wing somewhere, something on the back end to give a little bit extra downforce once they get into a hardcore testing program. If you go back to the 908, the launch car and the actual race car were two completely different looking vehicles. So what we have seen from Peugeot so far in terms of their competitor, I would take it with a grain of salt that that's what the actual race car will look like, especially once we get down into the actual testing and race phases for that car.
Yeah, I agree.
Even with the Toyota TSO 30,
Mhm.
that one looking completely different.
Yeah. I was going to go on to the GTE Pro class next because I think this was probably the story of qualifying, if you ask me. If you had to pick one headline, and it's not that Toyota was on pole because I think a lot of people had expected that, but in GTE Pro, it's actually the Hub Auto Racing Privateer Porsche, driven by Dries Van Toor, that was able to put it on pole with a 3-minute 46.882. Um, I'm trying to think of the last time we've had a privateer on
2012.
pole. 2012. Who would that have been with?
Um, I can't remember, but it was definitely in 2012 because in the early stages of GTE Pro, it was mostly made up of privateers.
All right,
So
I'm trying to figure this out now. It was actually correct. It was the luxury racing Ferrari 458 in 2012. So you are correct about that. Um, so yeah, I guess first time in 9 years we've seen a privateer on pole in the GTE Pro class. Now keep in mind there were only two privateer entries into that class this year, both of them Porsches with Hub Auto Racing and the WeatherTech Racing Porsche as well. Going down the rest of the order in that class, you had Ferrari in second with the 52 AF Corsa entry at a 3-minute 47 flat, followed by the 64 Corvette. I think a lot of people might have been a little surprised to see Corvette further up. They struggled a bit in practice, especially the 63 car at the test day last week. But they are sitting in third with the 64 car at least, a 3-minute 47 flat as well. Then the second AF Corsa Ferrari, the 51, is in fourth place, followed by the 91 Porsche. That would be the just factory Porsche of 3-minute 47.6. And then the 92 Porsche, which actually crashed before the Hyperpole session actually got going. They crashed in free practice 3 and weren't able to run in the Hyperpole session. Um, so that was. Did they? No, no, no. They crashed. Am I thinking about this wrong? I think they crashed at the beginning of the Hyperpole session. Um, but It's been a long day to the point where I can't remember if they crashed at the end of FP3 or at the beginning of Hyperpole because there was a big separation between the two. I think, yeah, I believe it was at the beginning of the Hyperpole session actually, because it was the number 8 Toyota that had crashed at Indianapolis in free
and
practice 3.
I do want to throw a point in there that So we got a mid-week BOP change in GTE Pro for the Ferraris, and to this point, the Ferrari has been the dominant car in the class with AF Corsa. So, and the last time we saw this was 2019 with the Aston Martin, and they ended up qualifying on pole, but that was probably the most memorable part of their contest that year, as they ended up falling to the end of the 17 car GTE Pro grid that year.
Yeah, I was going to bring that up as well, but yeah, as you mentioned, we did have a midweek BOP change before the qualifying session actually got on track. And then the last two cars in the GTE Pro class, as they will grid, were the 79 WeatherTech Racing Porsche at a 3-minute 47.682. And finally, the 63 Corvette, sitting quite a bit off pace, about 2 seconds behind that 79 WeatherTech Racing Porsche, with a 349.643. I know that's been alluded to a bit as a problem child this week during some of the commentary.
That car has experienced a crash. It experienced electrical issues in the test day. So it's had its fair share already. And again, this is the C8's first Le Mans. And the thing about Le Mans is you could have a perfect race car that has been developed tried and true everywhere else, but you bring it to Le Mans and it more than likely will have issues.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and that's certainly going to be something we talk about later on in the episode when it comes to, I think, particularly the hypercar category. Definitely want to talk about that a bit later.
Oh, by the way, the number 92 did crash in Hyperpole.
Yes, I know. I completely sent my brain somewhere else when I was going on about that because I knew it was Hyperpole. I don't know why I said Free Practice 3. Anyways, LMP2, I'm just going to go over the top three in the LMP2 and GTE Am class. It was the number 38 Jota Orica, a 327.950. Now keep in mind that the pulse-hitting Jota LMP2 car was only about 3/10 off, just under 3/10 off the tail end 709 Glickenhaus in the hypercar category. This is something I brought up in my latest video upload, if you had watched that earlier today, that there's actually not a ton of separation between the hypercars and the LMP2 cars, especially in race trim, which is going to be something else we talk about later on in the episode.
Well, and I want to point out that it wasn't too long ago, i.e. last year, that they were running 323s, I believe it was. So they were actually going faster than the pole time this year.
Yeah, I mean, those cars were significantly slowed down this year in the World Endurance Championship.
Other hypercars would be a little stuck.
Yeah, well, we'll call it that for lack of a better term. Yeah, you could have had like a 25 car battle for the overall win if you didn't slow them down.
Hey, it's preparation for the future.
Yeah, that's true. 41 number 41 WRT Orica was in second with a 328.4, and the 65 Panis Racing Orica rounded off the top three with a 328.586. GTE Am, it was an all Porsche top three. You had the 88 Dempsey Proton Racing RSR with a 347.987, so just under that 3-minute 48 mark. Qualifying lap times that were pretty comparable to that we saw in LMGTE Pro. Not sitting too far off that class, so a great showing by that team. The 86 GR Racing Porsche 911 RSR 348.56, and the 56 Team Project 1 Porsche RSR with a 348.8. That's just the top three in the GTE Am class.
And quick little note in there, the last time that the GT Pro and GT Am cars were this close in terms of qualifying pace was 2013.
Yeah, I mean, I know that they were very similarly matched that year.
They were, for 2 years, they were very similar matched. Mm-hmm. Actually, number 95 Aston in 13 qualified mid-pack of the GT Pros, so...
Yeah, I mean, that was a very impressive qualifying result by Alan Simonson that year. Unfortunately, passed away due to injuries at the race that year, which was a massive tragedy and a loss to the sport. But yeah, I guess sort of just alluding to what you said, something we haven't seen in a few years, that close with between the GTE Pro and GTE Am cars. So look for maybe a little bit of battling between those two classes at the start of the race. And no, once we get the Am drivers into the GTE Am cars, it's probably going to fan everything out naturally. But at the beginning of the race, you might see some intertwining battles between those cars. And then I guess let's just jump back to the hypercar category, because something I wanted to talk about, first of all, I guess we'll compare hypercar and LMP2, because one of the headlines this week that I've been reading on, and I might need your help here, Kevin. I'm not sure if you're going to be able to get the numbers I'm looking for. But one of the things I heard this week is that the LMP2 cars are thinking that with the performance cuts that they had received for this season, they reckon they could do either a lap extra at Le Mans, possibly even 2 laps more than they were doing last year. So based on that statement alone, it makes it sound like they're going to be doing comfortably 1 lap more on stints than they were last year. Now, the hypercars, I'm not sure how many laps they were doing last year on a stint. And not the hypercars, I guess it would have been like the LMP1 cars last year. And I believe the hypercars are targeting around 12 lap stints for this season. So I'm trying to figure out how many laps we could expect to see out of the LMP2 cars this year, because we're talking about 2 classes right now that are, decently similar on pace, to the point where if some of the hypercars run into even pretty mild mechanical failures that even send them into the garage area for 5 to 10 minutes, you could find an LMP2 car in the overall lead. And especially if they have a stint advantage in terms of how long they can run without having to pit for fuel. That could definitely play an interesting dynamic this race.
Exactly, and we've learned that pit stops are punishing. I mean, if this was 2018 when they had that rule set where you could do fuel and tires at the same time, that would have definitely kind of negated that a little bit. But I don't know. It's been pretty widely mentioned throughout that paddock, at least based off of interviews, that this is LMP2's best chance to win. Because if you look at the hypercar class, I keep wanting to call it LMP1, everything there is brand new with the exception of the Alpine. So the Glickenhauses more so, and the Toyotas, they both are probably going to experience mechanical issues throughout the race. And the Alpine, when it was in the hands of Rebellion, did not manage the 24 Hours of Le Mans without some sort of mechanical issue. The Orca 07 with the Gibson engine, which pretty much all of the LMP2 field has been very reliable over the years. I mean, they've had a few electrical issues here and there, and there's very rare times where you'll see an engine just completely let go. It's just a matter of keeping out the barriers for them, and they might actually have a chance to win the race overall.
Oh yeah, I mean the LMP2 Gibson engine has been extremely reliable over the past few years. It's very rare that you'll see any issues with those cars. And it almost brings me back a little bit over 10 years ago to an era that you and I are very fond of. Let's just bring up 2010 as an example, where you had one car, being Audi, that was able to really, they were at a disadvantage pace-wise compared to the 908s, but they were able to really push them to a point where Peugeot really didn't need to push that hard, and they ended up destroying all 4 of their cars. Now, do I think we're going to see a similar thing this weekend? Not really. I don't think you're going to see any of the hypercar manufacturers overdrive their cars that much to the point where they're going to let LMP2 cars bully them into a reliability fault. But it is something to think about. It's not unprecedented. And, when you have those cars, like the LMP2 cars, that can really just run bulletproof, as they have every year since 2017, I think that that's something you're going to have to look at for the race. Whereas some of the new manufacturers, Toyota, Glickenhaus, they might have to sort of pace it back a little bit overnight.
Well, here's the thing. So when you look at kind of the anticipated race, and if you look at even the qualifying and the fastest time for the Toyota and the fastest time for the leading LMP2 car, there's only about a 3-second a lap difference there. And that's not an insurmountable gap to overcome in terms of lap to lap variation, because we saw that. We've seen it happen before where a car can be 3 seconds slower than the fastest car and then still win the race. Now, it
Just
takes a
say the
lot for
year you're talking about. I know you want to.
2008. Very, very much well known race.
Yeah.
So, my point being in that is the LMP2s don't have to push the hypercars to brake, but all they have to do is just keep there as a constant reminder, like, hey, we're not that far behind you. You might want to go a little bit because if something happens, we're right here. And I
Yeah.
think that's going to be a constant reminder. And then I kind of want to throw in another point that when it comes to the slower LMP2 traffic, the the Ligier in the field, when it comes to lapping those, it's going to be more of a difficult task. So these drivers in the hypercar class are going to have to take more chances in order to get by them.
Right. And I did want to bring up some of the more specific issues we've been seeing potentially with hypercar reliability, not just this week, but also in the WEC season in general. One thing I've noticed, I guess if we're going to just talk about this week for starters, the brakes, especially today in qualifying and even in some of the practice sessions, between both Glickenhaus and even Toyota, I think especially, Toyota had their lockup going into Indianapolis, ended up going backwards into the wall with the number 8 car. Um, these are things that just really weren't that common when they had the TS050. It happened at Spa as well when they locked up and
Well,
went into a wall.
when you look at the TSO 50 versus the new GR10, you have to look at where the downforce really came into effect on the car. On the TSO 50, it was more of an body oriented package. When you're looking at the GR10, it's more of it's kind of, if you look at the IndyCar aero kits versus the UAK. The new car is more sleek. It has less aero bits. All of the downforce, or a majority of the downforce, comes from the diffuser and the under tray. So I think it is still a learning curve for these guys to how to apply the car properly at Le Mans, because you can't test here. You can't test anywhere near there. There's nothing like Le Mans. So, and plus these hypercars have not ran on public streets yet. So you don't get the variations, the curve in the middle of the road, blah, blah, blah. So it is a different animal, and they have to learn to adapt to this new type of car racing on this track.
Right. The thing is, I don't know if they're sort of out of time. I mean, we've gone through all the practice sessions. The only thing they have left before the race to sort out any last second issues would be the 45-minute, I think it's warm up session. I think it's 45 minutes on Saturday morning. And that's really just a session to shake down the car. You're not going to be making many modifications. So the point I'm trying to make is we've seen some brake issues from Toyota and Glickenhaus this season that otherwise wouldn't be that much of a deal. I mean, it's a simple brake lockup, but once they locked up for 2 times for Toyota, they've locked up and they've ended up in a wall. So if that happens during the race, at minimum, it could be something that you're able to drive away from with minimal damage. Could be something that you get stuck in a gravel trap. You have to wait for a crane to come tow you out. Could be something that ends with you in the garage for 10, 15 minutes while they try to repair your car. I mean, and we were talking about 10 minutes ago how if you're 10, 15 minutes in the garage, who's coming up from somewhere else? Oh, it's the LMP2 cars that are, there's a ton of them out there, and they're going to be trying to take advantage of those opportunities.
And here's another point I wanted to make was, since these are all new cars, at least the Glickenhauses and the Toyotas, how serviceable are they? Beforehand, we've seen the serviceability of the cars obviously evolve through the years, being able to do certain things faster. I know Toyota worked massively to get a hybrid change, situated after 2017 especially. But how serviceable are these brand new cars? Because you're pretty much hitting a reset button on everything, and there's very little carryover, I would assume, between the TSO 50 and the GR010, for example. And for a team like Glickenhaus, there's nothing to go off of besides your Nürburgring programs. And that's a different animal in of itself.
Right. And I mean, that's something where, Alpine could have an advantage in that aspect, not just on reliability, but also on serviceability if they do have any issues, because that car's been running since 2018. I'm sure they were able to get some notes from Rebellion Racing when they acquired those, I guess not those cars, but that one car, that could help them if they run into some of those problems. Now,
Absolutely.
oh, yeah.
Absolutely, Alpine has an advantage.
Yeah. Sticking on with Alpine, though, one thing we've noticed this year is that they've not been able to run quite as long as the Toyota and the Glickenhaus on fuel. Now, that's obviously a huge thing at Le Mans. You don't want to be giving up time in the pits by making extra pit stops. That's what cost you the race. That's what cost Peugeot the race in 2011. And so when I look at Alpine, one thing I've seen them say this week is that they are going to try to stretch it out so they can get to that 12th lap that the Toyotas and the Glickenhauses are expected to run. Now, it almost sounded like they had some trick up their sleeve to get there. The only way I could think of is Le Mans is a very long track with very long straightaways. You can coast into the braking zones quite heavily and not shave off a ton of time compared to some other tracks. I don't know if that's their plan or if they have some other trick up their sleeve, but when it comes to saving a significant amount of fuel, I don't really know what else they could be planning besides coasting, but that is something I've heard them say this week, is that they think they're going to have to try to stretch it out to that 12th lap if they want to even have a shot at contending for the win,
I,
provided that Toyota or Glickenhaus don't run into some other issues.
I do think, in terms of the design of the Alpine, even though it is, I believe the Alpine is a bit heavier, isn't it?
Correct.
So the thing that it has going for it is the aerodynamics of the car. It's a closed nose. It's very clean at the front. When you have versus Toyota and Glickenhaus that have very wide open channels in the front, which it's easier to hit a triangle with air versus a rectangle.
Oh, you
In
see,
terms,
this is I'd have to get Joe in here for this because I don't know anything about aerodynamics, but
well, and there's a point to be made with a lot of previous Le Mans competitors and the designs of them. That's why the 2009 Peugeot was significantly faster, is because they closed off those air inlets in the front and they just replaced them with ramps. So I think the aerodynamics of the car are going to come into play with it, as well as they also have numbers to work off of, and they can find a way to conserve fuel based off of what Rebellion has done in the past. Because if you don't forget, Rebellion had competitors to compete for that third place at Le Mans, i.e. S&P Racing and to a lesser extent Bicolis and blah, blah, blah. So I guarantee you that Alpine, a factory team, has something up their sleeve to figure it out.
right. Well, I mean, here's the simple fact of the matter: is that Rebellion R1, the car that they're running, in the previous 3 years that it raced at Le Mans, was never able to do more than 11 laps. They were able to hit 11 laps on some occasions, but they were never able to do more than 11. They weren't able to get that 12th lap. So what I'm thinking here is they had a reduction in power. The car is heavier, so I don't really know how that's going to, sort of offset when you have that power reduction, but you also have a weight increase. Um, Certainly having less power is going to save you fuel over a lap. I don't have the numbers that they have, though. It is possible. I certainly, if they believe that's what they have to do to be in with a shot, I'm sure they're going to try to do it. But it's definitely something we're going to have to keep our eyes on, because if we see them doing the 11 lap stints on Saturday and Sunday, that could be what costs them even a shot of winning the race, because I'd have to think of how many extra stops it would cost them at the end. I'm guessing it would cost them at least an extra one stop, though.
Too.
Yeah, probably an extra two stops, though, because that's what we were seeing with the Rebellion in previous years.
Well, and then again, there's also the big unknown. of reliability for the competitors because Alpine is the only one coming into this with a car that's raced there before. Not to mention, it's the same chassis as the Orca 07. It's the same motor, just with some minor performance upgrades as the Orca 07. So they're coming into this with a boatload of knowledge. Plus, Alpine has raced a very similar LMP2 car to this before, and they have done it very successfully. So they know how to work on the Rebellion R13 for the most part. They know how to service the Gibson engine. So it's not like they're just popping up. They've been here and done that. It's just now they're with different aero, a somewhat similar but also different engine configuration, and it's a race that they have won many times.
Yeah, well, Signatech, the team that's running that car, certainly is capable. They know what they're doing, and they're very experienced at Le Mans, so I wouldn't discount them at all.
No, they've been around for over a decade, so...
Yeah. Like I said, just something we're going to have to keep our eyes on for this weekend. Now, I talked about the qualifying pace in the hypercar category where, basically nobody was even touching Toyota. Not even Toyota themselves between the 7 and the 8 car. Well, I guess the 8 got reasonably close, but the second that Kobayashi put down that 23.9, I knew that nobody else was going to be able to take pole from him. Going to look at free practice 4 here. This was a night practice session, so just something to keep in mind. Run right after the Hyperpole qualifying session. This is where we see some of the other hypercars a little bit closer to Toyota because the top time in that session was Toyota. It was a 3:27.9 set by the number 8 car. The number 36 Alpine, though, second place. Only 0.2 of a second off at a 28.28. And then Toyota rounding off the top 3. We've noticed that with practice this week, and I'm going to try to pull up a couple of the other practice sessions as well. But in qualifying trim, it really looked like nobody was going to be able to touch Toyota. But in race trim, it looks like they're a little bit closer. Now, I find that interesting because when you look at 2019 and 2020, it was a little bit of the opposite, where the privateers were pretty close to the Toyota, admittedly, in qualifying. I believe Rebellion actually qualified second last year. But in the race, they weren't able to touch Toyota at all because they didn't have the advantage of hybrid boost that they could deploy in traffic to their advantage. So definitely something to keep in mind. Now, free practice 3, it was actually Alpine on top with a 26.5. Now, that was right before or not right before, but earlier in the day before the Hyperpole session. So I'm guessing that was a bit of a qualifying simulation time that they were putting down there with a 26.5 compared to a 28.0 and a 28.2 by Toyota, with Glickenhaus trailing a little bit further behind with a 28.7 and a 336.9 actually from the 709 car. 709 car, interestingly enough, actually ran into what they described as engine issues once again, it's been such a long day, I'm trying to remember which session that was, and I believe it was the end of free practice 3, where they were running into some of the issues with that car. Didn't look like anything too major, though, but it was described on the radio as, in quotes, an engine issue.
As usual, very, very descriptive of the issue from the Glickenhaus team.
Yes. Free practice 2 was Toyota on top. Both of them won 2 with the 8 and the 7 car at a 29.3 and a 29.7, followed by the Glickenhaus, actually the 708 with a 330.1. So actually, ever since free practice 2, though, the times have come down. I'd say probably we're going to see 3-minute 29s, 3 minutes 30s probably as the average lap times during the race, if I had to guess, but my guesses are also good as nothing because I thought a 3-minute 25 would be pole today. But in daytime running, it looks like Toyota might have a slight advantage just based off practice results, though. There's nothing of too much substance that I have to back that up. Actually, free practice 2 was a night session, so... and then finally, free practice 1, when I look at that one, it was Toyota, Alpine, and Toyota in the top 3. Actually, Alpine was only 0.8 of a second behind in that one, so it does look like a bit of a shakeup. It's unpredictable, but the important thing to remember is that at Le Mans, lap times really don't matter too much, especially in practice and qualifying. I think it's a little bit misleading when you look at previous years. I know I've brought up last year a couple of times, but I'll bring it up again. Last year in practice, Rebellion looked very strong. We actually thought, hey, this might finally be the year that we see a non-hybrid car on the top step of the podium at the end of the race. Sure enough, we get to the race and Toyota's in the lead. They don't really look back. On the other hand, we've seen years like 2011. They were very close, and we actually had a very close battle to the end of that race. But even like 2008, when Peugeot had like a 5 second advantage in qualifying and a 3 second advantage in the race, that's gone down as one of the classic 24 hours of Le Mans, if you ask myself and Kevin. Because, Le Mans isn't really all about lap times, it's about how you're able to progress through the race with pace. And if you're able to keep that car running those lap times for 24 hours. So I wouldn't really discount this race as a Toyota throwaway right now.
Oh no, it's since Porsche left, this is the most Toyota has been to losing this race. If you look at 18, 19, and 20 into it, it's like, yeah, this is Toyota's race to lose. And this year, there's a little bit of that uncertainty because, I mean, I don't honestly believe Glickenhaus is going to be a huge threat. And I hate to say that because I know they have a lot of fans. I myself want to see them do well, but they realistically, this is their first time doing a proper Le Mans prototype racing machine. Yes, we've seen them run basically an LMP3 at the Nürburgring, but again, that's completely different. This is a whole new thing for them. This is a purpose-built car that they have made, the little team that could, per se, and they're going into this with not as much track time as their competitors. Honestly, I can't see them doing as amazingly well as people think that they're going to do, just knowing the history of Le Mans and how it fares for brand new entrants. But they could also prove me wrong. But in terms of historically speaking, them winning the race would be highly unprecedented.
Yeah, I think Glickenhaus themselves know that they're in a very tough position to win the race. I know I saw an interview with James Glickenhaus where he said, we're not really banking on us winning the race this year, but it's not impossible. I think Kevin and I would agree with that sentiment very well, based on everything we've said this episode.
I mean, again, if they get both cars to the finish relatively trouble-free, then, I think that would be a huge win for that team in of itself.
Absolutely. I mean,
if you look back to the Nissan GTR LM, they got one car to the finish, and that was considered a victory for them.
Right, and it's not even just Nissan. It's any manufacturer that stepped up to the top class in their first year traditionally hasn't done too well. I know Toyota didn't really do too well, but that's also because they crashed the cars rather than had other issues with them, really.
And I want to throw this point in there is that Glickenhaus is technically an automobile manufacturer. Otherwise, they wouldn't be here right now. But they don't have the spending power of Alpine, who also has an F1 team, is a part of Renault. They don't have the spending power of Toyota. Enough said on that end. They're a little manufacturer. They're a peon compared to these other two companies.
Yeah.
The fact that they're going out there and they're going to attempt to go blow for blow with two global conglomerates, or at least one and one regional, you have to admire that. And you have to say, hey, you know what? They're going to give it their best shot. And if they make it through the race with one or both cars intact, that should be a win.
Yeah, I mean, here's the thing. It's the underdog story of the year. And it certainly hasn't been impossible. We have seen upset victories in the past. So, again, they know where they're sitting right now. I'm sure that they're going to do everything they can to run as well as they can. And if they find themselves near the front of the field, then that's an absolute win. But even if they don't, even if they make it to the finish with both cars without having any huge issues, I think that's a win of itself. Like you said, even Porsche, I thought about when they came back to LMP1 in 2014, they actually had one of their cars break down from the lead. I think it was the 20 car that year. with a few hours to go, and that really just cost them right there. So, you know, huge manufacturers with huge budgets have faced the challenge of Le Mans. So I
And
don't think anything Glickenhaus faces this weekend is really anything that they should hang their head in shame about, because taking on Le Mans in and of itself is a massive challenge, and I think they should be proud of it.
oh, absolutely, they should. The fact that they even made it to Le Mans when teams that have raced here before, like Bicolis, has not made it. We've not even seen or heard anything of their hypercar in a long time. The fact that they made it to this point and they made it to the race is massive for them.
Right, and
And
I would agree with that.
and remember, Glickenhaus, they really became a thing because they did like Ferrari rebuilds.
Hmm. Well, yeah, they're a boutique sports car manufacturer.
And I also want to point out that this is also not the Signatech team's first time in LMP1 or in the top class.
Go on.
Do you know what year that they raced in the top class?
I want to say 2011, but I'm
2010.
okay. I
They
knew
ran
it
a
was one of those sort of diesel era cars, or not diesel era cars, but diesel era time periods.
Yeah, they ran the 008 Lola Aston Martin in 2010.
Oh, was that
Frank
that was the
Black one, the black and white one.
was that the Kronos affiliated entry?
No, this was
That was
the double.
2011.
Yeah, that was the number 22 you're thinking of.
Okay.
But I remember Frank Malu being on that driver's strength.
Right. Actually, now driving for Glickenhaus.
Yeah, that's a name I haven't heard in a while too. So it's good to see, some names from a good era of LMP1 still going at it.
So, one of the questions that was asked by Studio VRM Racing is, did the size of Alpine's fuel tank change from the Rebellion LMP1 car? I've been trying to get a good answer on that. And the short one I can give you is I'm not positive, but I believe if I had to pick one or the other, I would say no. I think they're running 75 liters as their fuel tank for this weekend. Whereas the hypercars, I believe, are somewhere around 90. I've been trying to find the exact numbers, and if somebody in the chat's able to find those numbers for me, I'd greatly appreciate it. I know they're running less than Toyota and Glickenhaus. I believe it's around 75 versus 90 liters. I'm just probably a little bit off in terms of how exact that is. Now, other things to pay attention to this weekend. GTE Pro. There's actually going to be a press conference going on, I think, 5 a.m. Eastern time tomorrow morning, so it'll be Friday morning, where they're going to discuss the future, so I've heard, they're going to discuss the future of GT classes at Le Mans. Now, this sort of comes as a surprise to me. I don't know what they're actually going to announce, but some of the rumors we've been hearing going around, we've heard a variety of rumors. One of them is that they could completely axe, and again, don't take any of this as news. I am simply a boy on the internet shouting rumors that I've read from a variety of sources, so don't take any of this as gospel. But one of the things I had seen in the past is that they were considering getting rid of a Pro GT category entirely because of the influx of manufacturer interest that we're seeing for Le Mans Hypercar and LMDH, where it could sort of just act as a substitute. Got to remember that at Le Mans, they only have room for 62 cars. I know they're going to try to increase the entry capacity before 2023 and beyond. But right now, 62 cars. If you have 20 cars in the top class, if you have 20 LMP2 cars, that's 40 right there. You're giving yourself about 10 cars each for two GT classes if you still have them. You're operating right there at a little bit of a dangerous area. And I think that's something that they are certainly aware of. So that's one of the possibilities I've seen thrown around. I don't think it's the likely one, though. Just figured I'd throw it out there for starters.
Well, no, I don't think it's anywhere likely that they're just going to ditch the GT classes, especially a Pro GT class, or at least a place for the manufacturers to race. Because, I mean, Porsche has been committed to running a Pro car Ferrari has been committed. It's where they've always been. Corvette has always been there, and I don't think Corvette has any interest in doing a prototype at all because they want to showcase to everybody what is on the street, not what could be on the street in 10 or 15 years. So you got to be careful not to drive away, you know, something that draws people, because people want to see the C8s at Le Mans. People want to see the loud and noisy 911s. So they got to really take into consideration the situation that they're in.
Right. And in fact, while I'm on that subject of getting rid of a pro class, I think that the rumor for that was actually they could get rid of it as soon as the end of the 2022 season, which means that in 2023, when we get all the manufacturers joining, I'm trying to think of all the ones that are joining that, Audi, Porsche, Ferrari. I mean, there's a ton of them. I don't want to list them all. It would sort of be a precursor to all of that. Again, that was just one of the possibilities. Once again, can't talk, that I've seen thrown around. The second thing I've seen is the possibility of a transition to GT3 spec machinery. This is something that IMSA had announced in January, right before the Rolex 24. And that was pretty much a surprise announcement to, I think, most people. Certainly a surprise announcement to me. And if the ACO goes down the same route, I think it would be even more surprising, because I've always long held the belief that the ACO would take years and years and years to adopt GT3, even after IMSA would.
Oh, absolutely. And the rationale behind that is the ACO really does not like to recognize things that they did not create. And the GT3s were not an ACO invention. And that's why we've not seen them really recognized in anything close to WEC stuff. Like the closest we've gotten would be the Asian Le Mans series. So it's not. They'd really have to swallow their pride and say, okay, we have a problem. How are we going to fix it? And that would be the most logical answer. And it would take a lot for them to swallow their pride and say, yes, this is the best option. But I will say this. IMSA has proven it works.
Well, proven what works exactly?
Running GT3 cars across
yes.
Yeah, like, and the thing about it is there's a lot of manufacturers in GT3, a lot of carryover, in terms of manufacturers are coming over to LMDPI or whatever, or LMDH, excuse me. And also Hypercar. There's a lot of carryover in terms of manufacturers, but also you could have a lot of teams that run in the I keep wanting to call it the Blossipin series.
The Blossipin, the Blancpain?
It's how I've always called it. Okay,
you're killing me here.
The IMSA series, especially since they're going pretty much exclusively GT3 for their GT class. I say almost because there's still that coin in the air about the C8. There's a lot of carryover to other global championships that could open a big door, because if you look at the crown jewel of endurance sports car racing, it's Le Mans 24 hours, and there's a lot of teams that could compete at Le Mans that wouldn't have had a chance to before. And then they don't have to buy new machinery. They don't have to buy new technology, blah, blah, blah. They could just take their cars that they rent, the 24 hours at Dubai, the Rolex 24, the Nürburgring 24 hours, you name it. So it really will open up a lot of doors for a lot of teams.
Right. And I think the issue we're running into here, as I already said, but I mean, you were talking about how well IMSA has been able to take on the GT3 class and how it's improving their car counts over there.
Well, and if you look back to before GT3 was a thing in IMSA, we had the original GTD class, which was a real mishmash of Grand Am GT and then GTC from ALMS, where you had a purpose-built North America car and the older spec R8 and blah, blah, blah. Once they transitioned to GT3 machinery for that class, it became a true, holy crap, look at this class. Look at how good this race is kind of class. Beforehand, it was kind of meh.
Right. Well, I mean, I don't think the problem is we need to boost car count. In fact, I think it's the other way around, as I had said, um, where they have sort of a cap on the number of entries they can actually run both in the World Endurance Championship and at Le Mans because of garage space. You got to remember that this is not quite the same as IMSA, where they throw the cars in the pit lane. They have a paddock that the cars can go to during the race if need be. In the World Endurance Championship, all of the entrants are basically guaranteed a garage space where they can go to fix their cars if they need to during the race.
Well,
So
and
that's
that was another thing I was going to point out was the amount of entrants for WEC has been down substantially compared to what it used to be. So, I mean, you got these GT3 manufacturers now rushing to join IMSA or, the WEC or the European Le Mans Series or whatever. Now, all of a sudden, there's a lot of competition for those fights at Le Mans, which will become ever so more important.
right, but I'm trying to think if they even, because the thing I'm seeing here and everything I've been reading is that they're trying to eliminate a GT class. Or when I say they're considering getting rid of the pro class, it's because they simply might not even have enough room to run factory GT Porsches alongside factory GT Porsche, or not factory Porsche prototypes, and likewise factory Cadillac prototypes and factory Corvette GT cars. The grids might not even be able to accommodate that in 2023 and 2024. So I think that that's what they're looking towards more than let's try to boost the car counts that we have. It's just a question of which direction they go down. So I want to read off a couple more of the rumors
Well,
that I've been seeing.
can I put a period on that real quick?
Go ahead.
You can't eliminate GT Pro without eliminating GTM.
Okay, but there's a caveat to that though, and I'll get into that right now actually if you want. GTE Am would never go away before GTE Pro, and I'll tell you why. Is because you have the spending in that class, the majority of it is coming from gentleman drivers. If you're not too familiar with gentleman drivers, because you're not too familiar with sports car racing in general, there's a Netflix, it was on Netflix, I'm pretty sure it still is, a documentary about what gentleman drivers actually are. I believe it's called The Gentleman Driver. You can go check it out and sort of figure out what I'm even on about. They are the ones that are carrying in a majority of the money for the series in general. And there's a reason why, Kyle and I have gotten into this in the past as to why we put such an emphasis on Pro-Am or amateur classes in both IMSA, WEC, GT World Challenge, why we have such a prominent focus on AM classes. When we could say, all right, to hell with these guys, let the pros run and let's have the best of the best on track and nobody else. If you do that, your series isn't going to be as sustainable anymore because you're losing a majority of your funding. And if you axe GTE Am, that's exactly what you'd be axing. I think GTE Am, as it stands right now, is more friendly to those gentleman drivers, those paid drivers, than the LMP2 class, whereas LMP2 has sort of turned into a take couple of ex-Formula 1 drivers as your top two drivers, and then your third driver, your quote-unquote amateur driver, find somebody who's an FIA silver-rated driver, a bronze-rated driver coming up through the ranks in a junior Formula series and throw them in the car more than a paid driver, gentleman driver focus class.
So my point with you can't get rid of GT Pro without getting rid of GTM is the fact that GTM cars were at one point GT Pros.
Right.
So, if you don't get new cars, you're not going to have any cars for the lower classification.
Yeah, so you just cut out a second there, but I think I know what you're trying to say. You're trying to say if you get rid of GTE Pro, you're not going to develop any new cars for the GTE formula, and therefore GTM won't have any new cars. Yeah, that's true, and that makes sense. And there's actually, I'm just going to cite my source here as Sports Car 365. If you want to go read the article, it is the article about Corvette's GT future at Le Mans. You can go check it out. That is where I've seen some of the things that I'm talking about, and it's going to be the direct place where I'm talking about my next point here. where Sports Car 365 believes that the 2023 WEC season could see, I'm directly quoting at this point, could see only a single GTE class for the AM class entrants prior to a transition to GT3 spec machinery in 2024. So they would run GTE AM 2023 with the GTE formula before switching over to an AM focused GT3 base class in 2024. So you'll give it that transition year. Now, as I'm sure you know, GT3 was sort of always envisioned as a Pro-Am category. I know over the past few years especially, it's turned into an all-pro category in some of the events like the Nürburgring 24 and Spa 24. But over in IMSA, if you look at GTD right now, it is a Pro-Am focused class, even though sometimes it might not seem like it. And that was the original intention of the GT3 formula, so I think that fits into the puzzle there rather nicely if they were to get rid of GTE AM and replace it with a GT3 formula. The question there lies with, you have a single GTE, or let me catch myself here. You have a single GT class in general that's GT3 based. So are you going to allow pros into that class, or is it just going to be amateur focus entirely? And
Either way you look at it, if you go to a T3 class, a solo GT3 class that's Pro-Am oriented, you realize though it's still going to draw the manufacturers, and they're going to have to insert their guy into the teams. I mean, the Nürburgring is a perfect example. If you look at Manthey Racing, they're 51% owned by Porsche, like the actual brand. And then you got for instance, if Audi wants to throw it in there for the GT3 class, you got WRT. You have, Land. I keep wanting to say Land by or Multiplast by Land, but they're not sponsored by anymore. But Land Motorsports, you'll end up getting those, platinum rated drivers either way, or at least gold rated, that the manufacturers want to instill in there. But I think, honestly, though, the driver limitations will help.
well, here's the thing. We already are seeing that in GTE AM as it stands right now, where we're seeing some of the, I'll just make the example of Porsche affiliated drivers in the GTE AM class, despite the fact that they're far from amateurs. I mean, I'll look at Matty Campbell as one of them. We have Nicky Team, who is an ex, I guess he still is factory AMR driver. In the GTE Pro class, though, he was one of their pro drivers. He's racing in GTE AM this year for the factory Aston Martin team. I mean, there's other drivers there. Giancarlo Fisichella is in GTE AM. So, I mean, we already have sort of what you were saying, where you get the manufacturers are going to want to push some of their pro drivers into the class. That's already a thing. And I think it's always going to be a thing because you're going to look for any competitive advantage that you can. The only thing I would say, though, is if you're running an amateur I almost say GTE. If you're running an amateur GT class, whether it be GT3 or GTE, alongside factory LMH and LMDH cars, I'm fairly confident that the majority of the manufacturer factory drivers would be going to those overall win fighting LMH and LMDH cars. So you look at drivers in the past like Neil Yanni. He's raced for Porsche GTE cars, but primarily he was a prototype guy. I'll try to think of other examples off the top of my head, but I think a majority of those drivers would end up in those prototype drives, especially with the influx of customer entries that Audi and Porsche certainly want to get into. I know they've made a huge point about customer entries. I'm sure you'd see a lot more of those drivers there than you would in a GTE or GTAM class. I think the only reason they'd be keeping that amateur GT class is for those pay drivers, as I said. I think LMP2 at this point in time is a little bit too unfriendly for those drivers. It's a little bit too competitive, and the cars are a little bit too extreme. Not to discredit those drivers in any way, but I think the LMP2 class that we see nowadays is certainly a far cry from what it was even 5 years ago. And I think that
Absolutely.
I think the driver lineups of those cars reflect that. So I think they want to keep an amateur GT class. GT3 logistically would be the cheapest way to do it. Um, and it also does allow manufacturers from series like IMSA. Well, I guess IMSA. Well, yeah, entirely IMSA because IMSA is going over to entirely GT3 based GT classes. Um,
Well,
it would allow teams from IMSA from World Challenge to all go over, and and I think that that would be a strong point in terms of allowing amateur drivers to race. But I'm not sure they would have a huge focus on it being there for the pro drivers.
and I mean, also Le Mans, if they opened it up to GT3 cars, it would open it up to cars that we haven't seen at Le Mans. And
Right.
I'm not, and well, manufacturers too. Like I know they competed long ago in my early days to little to zero success, but Lamborghini, which I know there's rumors of their LMDH program, Mercedes, which has not competed at Le Mans since infamously 1999. Lexus is another one. Honda. I mean, it really does open it up the scope for manufacturers that haven't been there, not with a factory support effort, I be it, but I mean seeing the marks there.
Mm-hmm.
So I mean there is a lot at play. I mean, yes, when it comes to GT3 at Le Mans, it is a very much double-edged sword. It very much is. Because now you're opening it up to a very manufacturer influenced formula, but you want to keep it with pro-am drivers. You know that there's going to be some intermixing there.
Right. I want to quickly jump back to one of the questions that I saw in the chat here because it does go along with what we're saying. Somebody asked, "How about increasing the field?" Then I guess he means the field size. Is that possible? Um, to
As
an
it sits,
to an extent, yes. Where you could extend it if you're extending the number of garage spaces you have, unless they were to just completely ditch the garage idea and do a paddock idea like IMSA is doing. But that would be such a drastic change that I don't think they would want to go down that route.
oh,
Um,
they would definitely make a lot of traditionalists like me very angry.
well, certainly I would never see them doing it at Le Mans, but maybe for some of the other
Um,
races on the WEC calendar. I mean, they did it at Sebring when they ran the 1,000 miles, but um,
actually, um, if I could just throw in a quick exclamation mark on one of the points earlier
yeah,
that I made about how it'd make the invites more important. It wouldn't just be like you compete in a series and get an invite. You actually would have to do something. It'd put more emphasis on actually performing that invite as well.
yeah. But it really isn't as easy as increasing the field size because, like I said, they're constrained by the number of garages that they have. And that's just something that the WEC has always faced and Le Mans has always faced. Like I said, Le Mans right now is capped at 62 garages. I think their plans for 65 for 2023. I'm probably wrong. It's probably more or less a little bit more than that. Or a little bit more, a little bit less than that. But they are trying to add garages for the future. I mean, it wasn't too long ago we had 55 garages, and then they had the 56th one for the uh, innovative cars.
Which is making it this year
Yes, it is making a return.
of
Um,
no. But and I want to throw this in there as well is we're starting to edge close in terms of ratio wise because Nürburgring doubled the size and they only get about 120, 130 cars. So when you look at Le Mans, which is at half the size of the Nürburgring, when you look at how many cars versus how much space on track, we're starting to edge really close to those Nürburgring numbers.
yeah, I mean that's you're certainly right in saying that. I'm even thinking back to Spa when we had 50 something cars, I think, this year, and that track is quite a bit shorter than Le Mans. So Um, but it is a positive to see more entries. I know it's always disappointing when we see a bunch of entries on the reserve list. We just always say, why can't we just have all of these cars racing in the 24 hours? It's a big shame that we can't invite everybody who wants to race. But I guess the more manufacturer interest, the merrier, as I always say. In a dream scenario, and this is my absolute, you don't have to worry about garage capacity or any of that. What I would love to see is an LMH/LMDH converged prototype class at the front of the field, whatever you want to call it. Just call it LMH, but a lot of the LMDH cars, as they're planning on doing, you have your LMP2 class, you have GTE, or not GTE, I keep saying GTE, GT3 Pro, and then you have GT3 Am. I would love to see a field like that. Unfortunately, I think you'd have so much interest for all of those classes that you'd be looking at around 80 cars that want to show up, and you're simply not going to tell 20 entries to go screw when it comes to one of the biggest races in the world.
Well, they could, and I'm pretty sure that they have in the past.
They certainly could, but it wouldn't be a good look on the series, I don't think. And I don't think that's what they're exactly trying to do as well. Another thing to remember that I just remembered is that they're actually trying to bring a hydrogen class. I think around 2024, 2025, around that era, around that time period, I should say. So, you don't want to bring too many cars right now where you're not going to have room in a few years.
Well, honestly, though, how long have we been hearing about the hydrogen car, and how long have we heard about how they want to bring it to Le Mans? It's been at least 4 or 5 years. And yes, technology is getting better and they're getting there closer and closer. But honestly, I don't see manufacturers staking in for the hydrogen. Because we've been hearing about this as hydrogen was the next diesel since the diesel era, since the diesel hybrid era even. I'm not seeing it.
Well, yeah. I mean, we've heard rumors of it being an innovative entry, a Garage 56 entry, as they were called in the past. A few times in the past, we've heard rumblings about there being a specified class for those cars. I'm seeing that class, if it ever happens, as more of a proving ground rather than a top class competition. I haven't heard too many things about that class in recent months, but I know that was in their roadmap plan that they announced at the 2020 Daytona 24, that they want to have a hydrogen class around the middle of the decade. Didn't Kamui test hydrogen a few months ago? Yes, I believe it was at Fuji Speedway with the it was a Toyota Corolla, I believe, a hydrogen-powered Toyota Corolla over at the Fuji Speedway in Japan.
Contracts say that he can't drive anything but a Toyota.
Well, of course. Anyway, so if you've learned anything in the past 30 minutes, then congratulations, because I certainly haven't. But that press conference is happening tomorrow. I can't convert it for your time, but it's 5 a.m. Eastern time. So that's like New York time in the United States. Convert it to your respective time zone if you want to pay attention to that. I'm pretty sure they're streaming it on YouTube. You can also follow it on Twitter and all those platforms. I'm sure the press will be all over it.
Check your listings.
Check what?
Check your local listings.
Yeah. And we'll recap that after we do the race rundown next week. Everything from that press conference, because that's usually where they announce some exciting stuff. That's where they announced the Toyota GR010 and the Aston Martin back in 2019. It would have been at this point. The Aston Martin, the ill-fated Aston Martin Le Mans Hypercar. Still not going to let that Cosworth V12 down.
I will say this, though. At least the one good thing that came out of the Aston Martin Hypercar, it now has bumped up the AMR1 as now the least successful and decent LMP prototype racing car that Aston Martin has built, because at least that car made it to the track.
Hey, I made a video about it. I made a video about that car. You can go check it out.
A little bit of a plug there, but
yeah, I don't know if that was intentional.
Yeah, it was.
All right. Anyway, I mean, I've covered a lot of the things I want to talk about. It's been a decently long episode, but I want to give you an open floor here to see if there's any other talking points that you have before I just answer a couple more questions. There's a lot that we've seen this week, a lot that we've been trying to unpack, both news and on track, and I'm curious if there's anything else you had wanted to bring up in particular.
Well, I wanted to kind of cap off everything that we've talked about right in the last hour and a half, really, and especially the last half hour, 45 minutes. with just saying this, the sports car racing world is changing quite rapidly. I mean, if you look back, we're talking about GTE kind of dying off when 2 years ago the pro class had 17 entrants,
Yeah.
and down to what is it, seven, six or
Eight.
seven,
It's eight.
eight. When last year it was even lower than that, and now we're trying to think about what's the best way to replace that class. We're seeing the prototype classes on both sides of the Atlantic getting drastically overhauled, with DPI and LMP1 ultimately riding off into the sunset with fond memories from guys like us that's been around forever. The like it or not, the landscape is changing dramatically, and sometimes it's difficult to embrace that change, but we're going to have to do it as hardcore sports car fans and look towards the future. Group C had to do it, and they had to give way for the GT LMGT1, and then later LMP 900, and so on and so forth. So I mean, we have to embrace the change that's coming up for both prototype and GT racing across the world, and we have to kind of acknowledge the fact that some of the things that are being done are for the better, whether we like them or not. And you just got to kind of wait and see where everything's going to go.
Right. I mean, I think you said a lot of what I would say right there. I've said it in the past, but sports car racing right now, usually it's funny, and I've brought this point up in the past as well, but usually we'll see a lot of changing going on in either the prototype ranks or the GT ranks, one at a time. It's very rare that we see massive changes in both at once, and that's what we're seeing right now. As you mentioned with GTE Pro, I just mentioned this in the video that I uploaded earlier today. You said we had 17. I didn't know the exact number, but you said 17 cars in 2019 and 2018 and 2019 running at Le Mans, and this year it's 8. And LMP1, as you said, is a class that fell rapidly. Once you had Audi leave, Porsche left the next year. They sort of had to go into emergency meeting mode and figure out what they were going to do to salvage the rest of that class before they could come up with a replacement. Sports car racing definitely does change. We talk about the peaks and valleys of sports car racing. Right now, I think we're exiting the valley, starting to go back up the mountain. The future is definitely very, very high for sports car racing. And as David Land would say, our dear friend, who I'm so thankful to be able to talk to, he talks about the racing market in quotes. Think of it like the stock market. Well, right now you can buy low in sports car racing because in 2 or 3, 4 years it's going to be at one of its highest peaks. So I think right now is a good time to get into sports car racing. And that's all I have on that note. There were a couple more questions that I want to get to before we wrap up this episode. Ronnie Wynn asked, what are your thoughts on Alpine's Hypercar program? Right now, with the program they're running right now, and there's actually something I do want to talk about that we didn't get to earlier. I think myself and a lot of other people see this program as an evaluation, a cheap way for Signatech, the team that runs the Alpine program, to show the higher-ups, the money hands over at Alpine, this is what the hypercar category is. We can fight for wins. We can get really good exposure. We can try to go win Le Mans for a French manufacturer alongside Peugeot. I think that was their intention with taking the grandfathered LMP1 car. And I think it's doing its job at that. And I think we're going to see a commitment to that car, because I've seen rumors this week. Now it shifted from them potentially joining the Le Mans Hypercar ranks to them joining LMDH now is the latest thing I've seen. Looking around 2023, I believe I want to say for that. Could be 2024, but I think it was 2023. They may be trying to enter the LMDH ranks, in which case we could see a return of this car next year as well. It might get a bit of an exemption from the ACO to run one more season while they finalize a proper next generation prototype. So right now, I think that that's what that program is. It's not going to be running as efficiently as it can because they are running an outdated LMP1 car that, by regulation, isn't able to run quite as long as the properly designed hypercars are. It isn't really a properly designed hypercar. It's a rebadged LMP1 car with some power and weight added to it, or power taken away and weight added to it.
Now, I
But I
want
see
to
it
throw
as a
this.
band-aid right now, and I think it's good for the future.
I want to throw this in there that Alpine is no dummies when it comes to this, because they realize that this is the best chance that a privateer LMP1 car has to win the race. And, it's tried and true versus new. And we know that Rebellion car is tried and true. Now, you also have to take into account that Alpine, they have more than one racing program now. They also have the Formula One program, which obviously is not cheap. We even saw how, that had an effect on the Aston Martin sports car program when they announced they were going for Formula One. So the Signatech team does have a lot to prove this weekend. And I think the future of Alpine and sports car really does depend on the result from Le Mans, because this is their home territory. And Alpine is putting a lot of stock into this, even though their car is older and outdated technically. I mean, they're bringing their Formula One cars there, their drivers. It's on home territory. There's a lot riding on this. And I want to see Alpine continue because they were my favorite LMP2 team for a very long time. It just, I think this is the best chance that they have, and they need to seize it.
Yeah, and I think even if they don't find themselves in a position to win Le Mans, like I said, I think they know, and it's their intention to prove to the businessmen with suits at Alpine, this is what we can do. And if you can give us a little bit more money, we can build a proper car that can go up and compete against all these guys when sports car racing is at its peak and when they have millions of viewers, probably an all-time high viewership. This is the exposure we can give to your brand, and I think that's their intention right now. I think it's a smart way to do it, and it could see good things in the future from the Alpine side. The last thing I want to talk about, because somebody asked, it was a little while ago at this point. I'm trying to figure out who exactly asked. It was, I can't find the person who asked, but somebody was asking when the next session is. That will be the warm-up session on Saturday, this coming Saturday, obviously. 9:30 UTC time, 5:30 a.m. Eastern time. So that's, again, if you're in my time zone, New York time zone of the United States. 19:30, which is 7:30 p.m. if you're not using military time, because, well, you would be because you're not in the United States. And if you're in Australia, it's 19:30 Australian Eastern time. That will be the warm-up session. A few hours later, I think it's 4.5 hours later, will be the race start at 1400 UTC, 10 o'clock a.m. Eastern, and midnight Australian Eastern time. And yeah, you can check out the 89th edition of the 24 Hours of Le Mans, my favorite race of the year. I'm pretty sure I'm fair in saying it's Kevin's second favorite of the year, behind the Indy 500.
The key difference is I can attend the Indy 500, and I have done so since 2007.
Well, you can follow me to Le Mans in 2023 and many, many others as well.
As long as it's not Memorial Day weekend, I'm in.
Okay, sounds good. Anyway, I think that's going to be enough to wrap up this episode. Thank you all so much for tuning in. We had a pretty sizable viewership for this episode. Really appreciate it. Now, this episode is going to be going up on all the other podcasting platforms as soon as possible, because I want to get it out while it's still relevant, because obviously the race is only a couple days away here. So if you do want to give it a re-listen, you want to share it with some friends, it will be on those podcasting platforms within a few hours here. You can check us out on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts. All of them should be covered. And that's it. Hope to see you next week. Don't know what day. Hopefully Tuesday, where we'll be doing a 24 Hours of Le Mans recap episode. We'll be recapping whatever is announced at the ACO press conference tomorrow morning, and more. So thank you all once again for tuning in to another episode of the Rain Race Podcast. Hope to see you next week. Take care. Give me one.